April 3, 1988, Detroit, Michigan, the Silverdome in Pontiac, 30 miles north of the city, a structure built for football that the Pistons used as their home until the Palace of Auburn Hills was completed that fall. A building that seated 21,000 people for basketball, and on Easter Sunday afternoon in 1988 had approximately 22,000 in it, which is the kind of arithmetic that arenas permit when the game on the floor is producing the right combination of spectacle and stakes. Outside, the April air was cold in the way that April in Michigan often still is, winter declining to leave on schedule. And inside, it was the specific indoor warmth of a building full of people watching something they understand in their bodies to be significant. The sound of the crowd carrying the particular frequency of an audience that came expecting something extraordinary and is now watching it happen. Michael Jordan was 25 years old. He had scored 59 points. The game was still in progress. To understand what 59 points against the Detroit Pistons in 1988 meant, it is necessary to understand what the Detroit Pistons in 1988 were, which was the most physically committed defensive team in professional basketball and one of the most physically committed in the history of the sport. They were led by Isiah Thomas at point guard, who was 6 feet 1 inch and 180 pounds from the west side of Chicago, a player who had combined intelligence with competitive ferocity in a way that made him something closer to a point guard general than what the position had previously described. A man who could take over games from the point guard position and who had once scored 47 points and recorded 17 assists in a triple overtime win over the Denver Nuggets in December 1983, who in the 1984 playoffs had scored 16 points in 94 seconds to force overtime against the New York Knicks, who carried the ball with the ownership of a player who understood that the game was his to run. He was also, by the accounts of everyone who played against him, the most competitive person in a league composed entirely of extremely competitive people. Thomas had needed to be. He was the youngest of 9 children in a family that survived the west side of Chicago on the resources of a mother who was, by every account of the neighborhood, a person of stature and reputation in a community where both had to be continuously maintained. His father left when Thomas was 3 years old. His mother, Mary Thomas, had marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and had worked alongside Fred Hampton and had raised 9 children through the particular difficulty of the West Side in the 1960s and 70s. She asked one thing of her youngest son when the basketball talent became apparent and the prospect of professional money materialized, which was that he finish his degree. He finished it in 1987, receiving a degree in criminal justice from Indiana University 6 years after leaving for the NBA draft on Mother's Day. There is a street named after her on the west side of Chicago. They made a movie about her, Thomas said years later. The pride in that specific sentence audible across whatever medium in which he said it. He had been the 2nd overall pick in the 1981 NBA draft, passed by Dallas in the coin flip for the 1st pick, which became Mark Aguirre, Thomas's childhood friend, the two of them products of the same streets, who would eventually join Thomas in Detroit to win championships together. Thomas had taken the 21-win Pistons of 1981 and over a decade built them into back-to-back champions through a combination of individual excellence and a philosophy of team construction that understood winning as something distributed across 12 players rather than concentrated in one. He averaged 19.2 points and 9.3 assists across his career. He made 12 consecutive All-Star games and won 2 All-Star Game MVP awards. In the 1988 NBA Finals, playing on a severely sprained ankle that he had turned in the 2nd quarter of Game 6, he set an NBA Finals record by scoring 25 points in the 3rd quarter alone. The Pistons lost that series to the Los Angeles Lakers in 7 games. He would not lose a Finals again. They had Dennis Rodman, who that season was establishing himself as the most dedicated rebounder and defender in the game. They had Bill Laimbeer at center, a physical presence whose relationship with the concept of a friendly foul was approximately as distant as his relationship with the concept of a friendly smile. They had Rick Mahorn, who was 6 feet 10 inches and about 260 pounds, and whose approach to defending in the paint was consistent with what the name Bad Boys suggested about this team's general operating philosophy. They had Joe Dumars at shooting guard, who was quiet and brilliant, and who guarded the best perimeter player on the opposing roster every single night of his career, with the systematic efficiency of a man who had decided early that the defensive end of the floor was where championships were built. The 1988-89 Pistons finished 63-19, the best record in the NBA, and went 15-2 in the playoffs. No team that season came close to what they were. This was the team that Jordan had put 59 points on. The Pistons won the game anyway. because the Bulls of 1988 were not yet the Bulls of 1991, not yet the team with the triangle offense, and Phil Jackson and Scottie Pippen at the level of contribution that championship basketball required. And Jordan had produced 59 points largely by himself against a defense specifically designed to prevent him from doing exactly that. The Bulls won 112-110. Chuck Daly, the Pistons coach, watched the final box score and said something that became one of the foundational documents of the next 3 years of Eastern Conference basketball. We made up our minds right then and there that Michael Jordan was not going to beat us by himself again. We had to commit to a total team concept to get it done. Isiah Thomas, sitting in the locker room after the loss, was already planning. He had been a professional basketball player for 7 years at that point, had been the second overall pick in the 1981 draft out of Indiana University, where as a 20-year-old sophomore he had led Bob Knight's Hoosiers to the NCAA championship and been named Tournament Most Outstanding Player. Had left Indiana after 2 years because there was nothing left to prove in college and a team in Detroit that needed him and a mother who had made him promise to get his degree regardless of where the NBA took him, a promise he kept, receiving his degree in criminal justice in 1987, going back to school in the summers the way another person goes back to their hometown, because Mary Thomas had raised 9 children on the west side of Chicago after her husband left when Isiah was 3 years old and had asked one thing in return for the entire foundation she had built, which was that the youngest of her sons finish what he started. He finished it. He also became one of the great point guards in the history of professional basketball, and he averaged 19.2 points per game and 9.3 assists across 13 seasons, and was named to 12 All-Star games and won 2 championships and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2000. But in April of 1988, he was sitting in a Pontiac locker room thinking about the 59 points and what to do about them. What to do about them was already partially determined. Daly and his assistants had been working on a defensive scheme for Jordan since at least the 1988 playoffs, when the Pistons had faced the Bulls in the second round, and Jordan had averaged 27.4 points per game, and the Pistons had won in 5, but had watched Jordan take over games in ways that suggested the current defensive approach was insufficient for what was coming. The scheme that Daly and his staff produced, and which they called the Jordan Rules, was a set of defensive assignments specific to Michael Jordan and keyed to his position on the floor at any given moment. Push him left. He was less comfortable going left. Force him toward the middle where help was waiting. Double team from the top when he had the ball on the left wing. If he drove baseline, make him pay physically. Don't give up the dunk. Foul him before he gets to the rim, because the dunk is what the NBA was trying to sell, what the marketing department was building its entire campaign around, and the way to defeat the marketing campaign is to ensure it does not occur. Thomas described the deeper architecture of the Jordan Rules years later, in enough detail that the intelligence behind them becomes clear beyond the physical layer that the name suggested. Jordan was a reluctant passer, Thomas said. He didn't like to pass. He was the first volume shooter. He didn't have great handles, couldn't go left, and if he went left more than 2 or 3 times, he had to pick it up, and our job was to limit the possessions. Instead of you taking 30 shots this game, you're only going to get 25. But here's what was the key. Scottie, who normally gets 12 to 13 shots, this game, Scottie, you're only going to get 7 shots. Horace Grant, you might get 3 shots. And those shots that you're getting are going to be at the end of the shot clock with somebody running at you. The Jordan Rules were not only about making Jordan uncomfortable, they were about making the entire Bulls offense uncomfortable by making Jordan the mechanism of that discomfort, using his dominance against the team, because a team that defers everything to one player is exposed in the specific zone where that player's excellence runs out. Jordan, in the years between the 59-point game in 1988 and the eventual reckoning, had to be the most honest man in professional basketball about what was happening to him. The honest version was this: the Pistons were beating him, not scoring more points than him, not winning statistical categories, not outperforming him in the individual measures that determined a player's value. They were beating him by putting a number of large men between him and the basket every time he had the ball, and assigning one of those men to hit him with a hard foul every time he got close enough to score. And by doing this consistently enough across 4 playoff series in 4 years, that the pattern became a fact about what the Bulls could not yet do, which was get past Detroit. The Pistons won the Eastern Conference in 1988, 1989, and 1990. Jordan had played 59 points against them in a regular season game in April 1988. and they had built a defensive scheme in response and had eliminated the Bulls in the next 3 postseasons, despite Jordan averaging roughly 29, 29, and 29 points per game across those series. The most graphic illustration of what the Jordan rules looked like in practice came in the 1988 Eastern Conference semifinals, which was the first time they were deployed in a serious playoff context. When Jordan drove to the basket, Mahorn was waiting. When Jordan drove to the right, he was redirected left. When he went left and got to the rim, Laimbeer helped. When Laimbeer helped, someone hit Jordan with the kind of foul that the NBA of that era permitted, and which the players of that era understood as the normal cost of excellence near the basket. Jordan averaged 27.4 points per game in that series. The Pistons won it in 5 games. In January 1988, Mahorn had fouled Jordan so hard that it had sparked a fight that involved nearly everyone on the court, including Bulls coach Doug Collins. The Pistons embraced that incident as the moment they accepted their identity. They would be the bad boys. They would be the team that people in the other cities hated, and they would win championships. Jordan complained to the league office about the physical treatment. He went to Commissioner David Stern's office and said something needed to change. Thomas's recollection of this, delivered years later with the directness of a man who had been annoyed about it for decades, was characteristically blunt. Every time you were hitting him, he was going to the commissioner's office. Thomas said, "I watched Dr. J get beat up. I watched Magic get beat up. I watched Bird get beat up. I got beat up. Everybody got beat up." That's how the game was played. But the league wanted to market the dunk, Thomas said, and so they changed the rules to protect the dunk. And what that meant in Thomas's accounting was that the Jordan rules were made increasingly illegal as Jordan became increasingly central to the NBA's commercial project. This is Thomas's interpretation rather than settled history, but it contains a genuine complaint about what was being asked of defenders during this specific period, which was to stop a player who was being protected in ways that previous generations of great players had not been. The question of who was right in this argument, Jordan, who was being hit, or Thomas, who was doing the hitting in the service of a strategy that a champion has every right to employ, is one that the evidence does not resolve cleanly, and both men have maintained their respective positions for more than 3 decades, which is itself a fact worth noting about the depth of the competition between them. What the 1989 Eastern Conference Finals looked like from the inside was this. The Bulls had gotten past the Cavaliers by way of Jordan hitting one of the most famous shots in playoff history, a pull-up jumper over Craig Elo in the closing seconds of Game 5. The series known from that moment forward as The Shot, a possession so complete in its drama and execution that it required no additional description, just the 2 words, as though there were no other shot in the history of basketball worth distinguishing from the category. They had beaten the New York Knicks in the second round. They faced Detroit in the conference finals, Jordan's first time at that stage, and the series went 6 games. Jordan averaged 29.7 points per game. He scored 46 in Game 3 to give Chicago a 2-1 lead, and the series appeared briefly to be turning. Then the Pistons closed it out in 3 straight. Jordan scored 42 in Game 6 and hit 2 free throws with 4 seconds left to win that game. The Pistons won Game 7. They went on to sweep the Los Angeles Lakers in the finals. The 1990 Conference Finals was the same series in reverse. Jordan averaged 31 points per game. Back-to-back 40-point performances in Games 3 and 4 pulled the Bulls back from 2-0. But Horace Grant struggled in the middle of the defense, and Bill Cartwright and John Paxson disappeared. And the Pistons' interior presence, Rodman and Laimbeer and Mahorn, controlled the boards in the decisive games. Jordan got little help from the players around him. Dennis Rodman, operating at the precise peak of his brilliance as a defender, enveloped the inside for Detroit so completely that the offensive rebounds were effectively Detroit possessions before the Bulls had finished their shots. Jordan scored 47 in Game 2. In Game 7, the individual talent could not substitute for the system gap. The Pistons won in 7. They beat Portland in the finals for their 2nd consecutive championship. Thomas was finals MVP. He had 2 rings. Jordan had nothing from the postseason in the years that mattered most, just the evidence of what he had done and the knowledge that the Jordan rules were the specific mechanism of his failure, the proof that individual excellence operated within limits, and that those limits could be constructed deliberately by people who understood the game well enough to identify the weaknesses that talent could not compensate for alone. In the years between the 59-point game and the eventual resolution, Jordan did something that few competitors in any sport have been willing to do at his level of talent, which is to admit that the problem requires physical reconfiguration rather than simply more of what was already being done. He bulked up. He had come into the NBA as 6 feet 6 inches and 195 pounds, the kind of lean athleticism that produced the 40-plus inch vertical and the hang time that had made him famous from his first season. After the Pistons continued to demonstrate that leaning into him was a strategy that worked, Jordan added roughly 20 pounds of muscle over several off-seasons, working with trainer Tim Grover in a strength program that was not standard practice for guards in that era, who tended to prioritize mobility over mass. He arrived at 215 pounds, still fast enough, still vertical, but now capable of absorbing the hard fouls and converting through contact rather than being turned by it. Daly had built the Jordan rules to stop a player who was 195 pounds of lean speed. The player who arrived in 1991 was 215 pounds of the same speed, with more stability in his base and more ability to initiate contact rather than absorb it. The physical premise of the Jordan rules had been partially altered by the off-season work Jordan had done in direct response to them. He also, with Scottie Pippen's development across the same period, began to participate in a version of the offense that distributed the load rather than concentrating it, the triangle offense that Phil Jackson brought in 1989, the system that Tex Winter had built and that Jordan initially resisted and eventually mastered, which required him to trust the geometry of the floor to find him, rather than simply taking what his individual talent could extract from any defensive configuration, regardless of its quality. The Jordan rules were a scheme built for a player operating alone. They had no adequate answer for a player operating within a system that turned double teams into open shots and turned the best defender's commitment to one matchup into a liability for the team around that defender. The 1991 Eastern Conference Finals was not close. Chicago swept Detroit 4-0. Jordan, Pippen, and the triangle had become something that the Jordan rules could not contain, because the Jordan rules were a scheme built for a player operating alone, and Jordan was now operating within a system, passing out of doubles, finding Pippen on the weak side, using the floor in ways that made the double team a liability rather than a solution. The Pistons, who were aging and who had spent 3 years winning championships in ways that had aged them faster, walked off the court with 8 seconds remaining in the final game without shaking hands. Thomas led them off. The walkout became one of the defining images of the rivalry, and Jordan's response to it, delivered over 30 years in various interviews and documented most comprehensively in The Last Dance, was consistent. He knew it was all wrong, Jordan said when he saw Thomas's explanation replayed during the documentary. Whatever he says now wasn't his true actions then. He's had time to think about it. Thomas's explanation was that walking off without shaking hands was how it was done in that era. When you lost, you left the floor. That was it. The NBA's subsequent expectation that losing teams congratulate the winning team before leaving the court was, in Thomas's account, a direct consequence of the public reaction to the 1991 walkout. He may be right about the historical causation. What is not in dispute is that he and Jordan did not shake hands, did not exchange the formal acknowledgement that the series was over and the outcome had been determined, and that the relationship between them had been built on a foundation of physical competition and mutual antagonism that made the handshake, in that specific moment, feel to both of them like something neither was willing to give. The Dream Team is the other monument in this landscape. The 1992 Olympic basketball team was built from the best active players in NBA history, and there were 12 spots, and Isiah Thomas, who had 2 championships and a Finals MVP, and 12 All-Star selections and 25 points in a third quarter on a sprained ankle in the NBA Finals, and every credential that the selection process was supposed to weigh, did not receive one of them. The team was composed of Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, Scottie Pippen, Clyde Drexler, Karl Malone, John Stockton, Chris Mullin, Patrick Ewing, and Christian Laettner, the only college player included. Thomas was not on it. Christian Laettner was. Thomas has noted the specific arithmetic of this outcome many times across the subsequent decades. The committee that selected the roster did not make public the deliberations. What has been reported in enough different sources with enough consistency to constitute something close to the established account is that Jordan communicated to USA Basketball that he would not participate if Thomas was on the roster, and that Magic Johnson, who was also on the team, shared the preference. Thomas has said this publicly and with clarity across multiple interviews. Jordan has not publicly confirmed the specifics, which is itself a position. The team was selected without Thomas. It won gold in Barcelona by an average margin of 44 points per game. beating Angola by 68, Croatia by 33, and Germany by 43. The images from that summer are among the most famous in basketball history. The 12 greatest players in the world assembled on a single court for a nation, posing for photographs and destroying every opponent they encountered. Thomas was not in any of the photographs. He watched from outside. He was 31 years old, in the middle of his career, fully capable of competing at the level those games required. He was asked about it many times over the following decades and gave different answers in different contexts, ranging from assertions that the exclusion did not bother him to detailed accounts of what he believed happened and who he believed was responsible and what he thought it meant about the character of the man he had competed against across 4 playoff series in Chicago and Detroit, and every building in between. In terms of my era and what I've seen and played against, Thomas said after Jordan's final game as a Wizard in 2003, he was the best ever. He was complete in every area. These were the words of a man who had spent 15 years competing with and around Michael Jordan, and who was capable, in the right moment, of saying plainly what the record indicated. The words carry more weight coming from Thomas than they might from someone who had not spent the better part of a decade trying to build a wall between Jordan and the championship. He knew exactly what Jordan was. He had done more to stop it than anyone, and he was still saying it. Jordan scored 59 points against the Detroit Pistons on Easter Sunday, April 3, 1988. The Bulls won 112-110. Chuck Daly built the Jordan rules in response. For the next 3 years, the Jordan rules held. Jordan, across those 3 playoff series, was individually brilliant in 5 of the 7 games of the 1990 series and 6 of the 7 games of the 1989 series, and averaged close to 30 points per game across all of them. And the Pistons won those series anyway, because the Jordan rules were not about stopping Jordan from scoring. They were about ensuring that Jordan's scoring was insufficient, that what he could do alone was not enough to beat what the Pistons could do together, that the ceiling of an individual talent operating at maximum capacity was lower than the ceiling of a championship system operating at maximum capacity. This is the specific insight that makes the Isiah Thomas-Michael Jordan rivalry more philosophically interesting than it first appears. Thomas was not arguing that Jordan was not the best player. He was arguing that being the best player was not enough. He was arguing, with his body and his scheme and his teammates, and eventually with 4 consecutive playoff series, that the game was a team competition, and that the team competition had answers for the individual competition that the individual competition could not simply outscore its way past. He was right for 3 years. The evidence is unambiguous on this point. And then Jordan, with Phil Jackson and Scottie Pippen, and the triangle offense and 20 extra pounds of muscle, demonstrated the answer to Thomas's answer, which was that the best player in the world, surrounded by the right system and the right teammates, and developed across enough time and enough failure to understand the difference between what talent could do and what talent deployed within a system could do, was something that no defensive scheme, however intelligent and however committed and however physically enforced, could stop. The Jordan rules had a simple rebuttal, and it was the 1991 sweep, and it took the Bulls years of getting physically beaten to find it. What the rivalry between Jordan and Thomas cost each man is harder to calculate than what it gave them. Thomas does not have a dream team ring. The exclusion from 1992 is the thing that basketball people return to most consistently when evaluating his career. The sense that one of the greatest players at his position in the history of the sport was denied the thing that even secondary contributors received, and that this happened because the best player in the world decided it would. Jordan spent 4 postseasons getting beaten by the Jordan rules and had to remake his body and his game to earn the right to stop being beaten. The rivalry made both of them more than they would have been without it. Thomas, from the west side of Chicago, became the best player on a Detroit team that resented the way the NBA's marketing had positioned the Bulls as the natural heirs to basketball relevance and competed with everything available to him against the assumption that Jordan was inevitable, that the story was already written, that the only question was the timing of the ending. He competed so hard and so intelligently and so physically that he delayed the ending by 3 years. The ending came, but in the specific time when the outcome was still uncertain, when the Jordan rules were in effect and the double team was waiting and the foul was coming every time Jordan got to the rim, Thomas was one of the only people in the world who had a real answer to the question, and his answer worked. Jordan still hates the Pistons. He said this clearly and without apology in The Last Dance, more than 30 years after the rivalry's conclusion. He said they made it personal. He said the walkout was wrong. He said the physical play was designed to hurt him rather than simply stop him. He has maintained these positions across decades of professional life, in which the competitive need for the hatred has been absent, which says something about how deep the Pistons got into him, how far the Jordan rules reached beyond the basketball games they were employed in, how much of what Jordan made himself into in the years following 1988 was built in direct response to Isiah Thomas's willingness to foul him hard every time he went to the basket, to put a defense between him and the championship that he could not force his way through alone. Michael Jordan got to the rim on April 3, 1988, and scored 59 points. Then Isiah Thomas spent 3 years building a wall that Jordan couldn't get through by himself. And then Jordan spent 3 years building a team that could go through the wall together, and swept the Pistons in 1991, and won the first of 6 championships, and spent the next 30 years still carrying the heat of what the competition cost him. In the karate films, the student beats the teacher, and that is the end of the story. In this story, the student beat the teacher, and neither of them ever stopped fighting about it.